Thank you for joining us today. We'd like to welcome you to this discussion of workplace violence. This is part of the Crisis Coach series presented in conjunction with the Tennessee Association of Independent Schools. We're Firestorm. My name is Bill Baker, and we're pleased to have you join us. We invite you to become our friend on Facebook. You can join us at Firestorm Solutions. You can also follow us on Twitter, Firestorm Soul. There is a hashtag for this session, and that hashtag is Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risks and crises. Firestorm has expertise in crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communication, crisis public relations, and consequence management. The presentation today is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion, and the work product that's presented today must be considered in conjunction with your organization's personal counsel. In addition, the comments and the information given should not be interpreted as legal advice or legal opinion. We're pleased to have the Tennessee Association of Independent Schools helping us present this Crisis Coach webinar series. This is the 6th in the series, and this discussion today is on workplace violence. Our presenter is Jim Satterfield, who's the president of Firestorm. You can visit firestorm.com, watch previous webinars, and sign up for future webinars. The Crisis Coach webinar series is underwritten by our good friends at the Tennessee Association of Independent Schools. And we're pleased to have with us today Jill Royka, who's the assistant director. Jill, over to you, please.
Hello. Thank you so much. We appreciate this partnership and all that you are doing for our schools, because everybody needs a little more assistance with safety and knowing what to do if a crisis was to happen. So we appreciate all you're doing for our 59 schools.
And we appreciate the Tennessee Association, the program that you've done there, and the schools that we've had a chance to meet with. It's been an interesting interaction for us here at Firestorm. And Jill, I look forward to your meeting coming up in November. I think you said that's the 2nd and the 3rd, where you're going to be bringing schools together from all over the state of Tennessee. Do you want to talk
November
a little bit about?
Yeah, thank you. November 2nd and 3rd, and it's at Brentwood Academy in Brentwood, Tennessee, which is just south of Nashville. And we're expecting probably 1,300 people at that conference, and we'll have 250-plus session offerings. So this Sunday, there's a keynote speaker, and then 2 blocks of sessions, and then Monday there's a keynote speaker and 4 blocks of sessions. And they're amazing sessions, and our committee has done really well with making sure there's something for everyone from pre-K to senior year, and then administrators as well. So we're looking forward to that.
And we're looking forward to being there with you for that session coming up on the 2nd and 3rd of November, just to remind
Thank you. Thank you for participating in that, too, because there will be so many people need to know what you're saying.
Well, thank you again. Thank you for that opportunity and for the webinar series that we've done this year. We're going to take off next month and then restart, I believe, in September, if I'm not mistaken. So,
yes, we'll get the dates posted as soon as we get those solidified.
And if anyone has particular topics they would like us to talk about or to discuss, just let Jill know at the Tennessee Association of Independent Schools, and we'll get that worked into the editorial calendar for the 2014-2015 school year. My name's Jim Satterfield. I am president and founder of Firestorm, and we're glad to have everyone here again today. And as we always do, we want to open with an update of some of the things and stories that we've been seeing that affect our schools around the country. And we obviously have had a great many shootings and episodes of violence since the last time we spoke last month. Most recently, we had the Oregon school shooting that happened on the last day of school, and we saw that play out on television. And one of the things that didn't get mentioned, but just would be an interesting piece of information for you to know, as the students were evacuated from the school and went through the police, there was a simple pat-down just to make sure that everything was all right. And as they did that, they uncovered 2 other students with guns in the school. They were unrelated to the shooter, were not involved in that, but it was, I think it's an interesting fact that the shooter was not the only person who brought a gun to school that day. And it shows that this is much more pervasive than we've seen. We've had the shooting at the Walmart in Las Vegas that occurred at a coffee shop where some individuals shot 2 policemen, went through, shot a shopper at the Walmart, and then committed suicide outside of that. The Seattle Pacific University shooting, this is a Christian college, liberal arts, in that area, and the man came in and attacked and was brought down by pepper spray. It's one of the few shootings where it did not end in the death of the shooter associated, and that's normally the most common place. And we all remember the California at Santa Barbara. There was a story that you may have missed that occurred last month out of Minnesota. There was a student in the school that was planning an attack, and he had been building a supply of pipe bombs and ammunition to attack. Someone saw something, raised the question with the police, and they were able to intervene before it occurred. We like that story much more than the others. There was a shooting also in May at the FedEx here in the Atlanta area. A disgruntled employee came in and brought a weapon to school. If you haven't had a chance to listen to it, you can search online and find the 9/11 911 tapes from that day from the FedEx location. And it's a 4-minute clip, but it will give you a feeling of the confusion that happens in that type of a response and involvement. And it's a good one as you get your school team together to understand a little bit about what's involved in it. We search for the term school and gun every day, and it happens well over 60 times, over 6 times a day. We see those being mentioned in tweets and communications in the marketplace. We're also going to talk today a little bit about behavioral threat risk assessment, because that's the one thing that everything has in common up above. Had a threat assessment been done in every one of the cases, this could have been prevented and the action couldn't have occurred. It's an area I'd like you to think about for your school for this next year as we go forward. So we've been talking in the webinar series with the Tennessee Association about all the things that are behind our students, all the threats, all the issues and vulnerabilities, with the objective of simplifying preparedness as we go through. Every day is a human crisis, and unfortunately today the new norm is workplace violence. You'll see statistics in a few minutes about this, and we're talking today about violence coming into the workplace. We're not talking solely about armed intruder or active shooter, but domestic violence and others are now coming into the workplace, and your school is a workplace. So as you think about that, having your people prepared make a difference. You do not want to come to work and have the yellow tape across the line of the entrance into the school. These are the things that we're concerned about. There was a book written by 2 Harvard professors, you see their name at the bottom of the screen, back in 2004, and they were talking in that book called Predictable Surprises that almost every disaster, every incident of school or workplace violence, and act of terrorism was preceded by warning signals. That's where that behavioral threat risk assessment becomes so very important. That's why the monitoring of social media is so critical. That's why we're concerned about that information is present in your school, and you want to know it before it rises to the level of an attack. So are we safe today? These are statistics back from a number of years ago. You can look at those numbers. They've gone up. Clearly, you've got the law of large numbers here, that there are a great many businesses and a great many schools, and how many schools is it happening in? It's a different scenario associated with it. So you're protected because of the size of the population pool there, but not having a plan within your business creates a specific problem. And we'll talk about the OSHA and legal requirements in that area in just a moment. When you look at school shootings, and I haven't updated this particular chart, but we have seen over the last 18 months as many shootings in that 18-month period as we had had in the previous 5 or 6 decades. So school shootings are much more common than we could have seen before. There are 2 million episodes of workplace violence annually in the United States, and there are 2.1 million episodes of bullying annually in the United States. Interesting that those 2 numbers have some correlation in size. One of the first expert council members at Firestorm was Dr. Everett Koop, and he drew a direct link between bullying in schools and later violence that occurs. And so it's an area that we want to be aware of and to look at, and things like anonymous reporting within your school becomes an extremely critical aspect of it. The little barometer or thermometer on the side gives you an idea of where we want you intervening, and that's at the area of behaviors of concern. We think it's very important that you start to recognize those behaviors before they become threatening, before they rise to physical injury, and then ultimately death. We have more control in that bottom area, the behaviors of concern, than you do at any other point. We're not teaching students how to disarm an armed intruder, how to take a gun away from someone. Our goal is to try to identify that threat before it rises to that level where the only out would be able to bring that gun. Who are the workplace shooters? Well, they're generally male. Most of the time it's a single attacker. The Walmart episode is an example. It's the one in recent time that can be shown that it was more than one person. And if you look at the last line, twice as many attacks are committed by current employees than former employees. That's a trend that seems to be continuing around the country. We also will be sharing that domestic violence is coming directly into the workplace. When you look at the school shooters, you'll see I've highlighted in red there that 75% felt bullied, and look midway down, 2 out of 3 had never been in trouble. That's a very startling statistic. So the people that you're thinking are okay that are really the potential threats. And if you look at the last 2, this is that area of monitoring social media, of the anonymous reporting that becomes so important. 80% of the time there's leakage. Leakage is the term where a person, someone else knows about it, and 2/3 of the time 2 or more people know. So they've seen something, they've overheard something, they've had a direct conversation. So if you knew that, those are directly then opportunities with the see something, say something, to intervene at the point before it becomes an actual threat within your school. The statistics are quite large, and you look at the number of incidents here. The area that most people do is they just ignore the threat and don't have it into place to deal with it. Now, OSHA has identified workplace violence as a known hazard. You are required then to have a plan in place to deal with the threat associated with it. And so every one of our schools should have a workplace violence plan in place to be in alignment with the OSHA requirements. There are multiple issues here about to safeguard against preventable harm, an obligation to respect the employee's rights during an investigation. All of these become legal issues that are associated with it. As we look a little further around it, we've got OSHA regulations, we've got negligence, privacy, anti-discrimination, attorney-client privilege. All of the factors are ones for you to consider in each of these areas. When you look at criminal liability, there's an interesting case that came out of Arizona, and they had an employee who was killed in this particular business, and they held the company criminally liable for the death of the employee because they didn't put safeguards in place. So think about that. If that same ruling were to come down for an event that occurred at your school, that could mean the head of school could be held criminally liable, or the board criminally liable in these areas. So this area of liability is an expanding area of law from an accountability. So failure to plan means that the business judgment rule may not in fact apply. And so we've seen in Arizona already a death being held back accountable to the employer because they didn't put the proper levels of security and protection into place. So when you think about workplace violence, what is it? How is it constituted? Well, it's either psychological or physical, and you see the list there on the screen. Intimidating presence, harassing calls, obscene calls, threats, beatings, rape, shooting, stabbing, suicides. All of these actions would be workplace violence, and that's where we're focused in on these areas today. There's certainly, we've seen domestic violence moving into the school and into the business. If there was a teacher who was going through a divorce and there was a hostile relationship there, the spouse knows when the teacher comes to school at the start of the day, when the teacher leaves at the end of the day, where the teacher is during the day. So it's a very logical aspect to see that violence move away from the home setting into the business setting, into the school setting, to have a direct impact. You've got individuals that don't handle stress well, and that's another aspect of a violent reaction. And if there's not specific protection programs in place, and then the lack of a formal behavioral risk assessment and follow-up. I believe over the next year to 2 years, you're going to see this as a legislative requirement to have behavioral threat risk assessment programs in place within your organization. Now is the time to begin to think about each of those, and we'll show you in a few minutes what goes into those areas. But I want to return back to this. This is that same thermometer that we saw vertically, now just converted horizontally. And the ASIS is a security association nationally, and they're looking at this, and they're the one that developed these 4 trigger points for you to focus on, this spectrum of workplace violence. And as you look at it, our goal is obviously to keep anything from happening. But if the behaviors of concern are the first point where an intervention needs to take place within your school. It's the point that you want to be able to recognize what are those behaviors of concern and start to evaluate them. If there's an escalation and there's a threat made, clearly we want to intervene at this point. No one's hurt. Nothing has happened to anyone. And so these are the 2 areas that the primary focus for preventing workplace violence comes into place. We're seeing a national debate today about guns in the workplace. And there's feelings of individuals need guns to protect themselves, or others that think that guns should be banned completely. If we put our focus here on the behaviors of concern, the gun doesn't come into the picture. Our ultimate goal is to keep the gun out of the workplace. Now, we focused on gun in the conversations here, but in Pennsylvania this year, we had a student stab and kill another student because she wouldn't go to the prom with them. This area doesn't require a gun for violence to take place. But as you think about your school, you think about your plans, do you have a program in place to identify behaviors of concern? Do you have a program in place to intervene when threatening behavior is recognized and seen, all before we get to the physical injury and the death? Because to the right of this screen, we're calling the police department. To the left of this screen, you and your school leadership are under control. So is the person at the end of the hallway a threat or not? Looks a little scary at this point in time. So as we think about combating workplace violence, we go back to the Firestorm: predict, plan, perform. So we want to start to look at what we need to do in each of these 3 areas today to have a direct impact on workplace violence. So understanding the threats and the vulnerabilities is involved in that first stage. And this is the area where your investment of time will pay the largest dividend for your school and your business. Recognize and accept that there's risk. I mean, we employ people. You have families that are disrupted. There is substance abuse. There are multiple issues that could call it. If we listen, if we're listening to our people, what's being said, if we're monitoring social media, we're going to hear about these areas. And we need to accept responsibility to prevent this from happening and to direct our response when it occurs. Work within it, your school, to create this type of a safe environment. All of those things are what we're looking to do. Now, we've talked about warning signs and what are some of the red flags, and you'll see a long list here, and we're going to go into this a little bit more in a couple of additional slides, dividing it into two different levels. But if you look at this, someone that's blaming others, someone that's fascinated with violent criminals, someone that's paranoid, someone that feels they have a sense of hopelessness. By the way, there's a direct link between suicide threats and violence in the workplace, with the goal of ultimately having death by cop associated within it. So one item here is not an immediate trigger that we have to take action. What we're looking for here are the areas that start to come into place. Now, the key here is look at the last line. It's behavior versus demographic. We're looking specifically at the behavior signs to trigger what our plan should be. This is where the warnings come in. Now, we want to assess the situation, determine if that person really poses a threat. In developing a response, you've got to figure out who the victims would be. What would this be during the day? And as you know, if you've gone through doing an assessment of your current plans, as Firestorm will do, and we'll mention that again at the end of the webinar today, one of the standards and best practices today are that classrooms need to be locked from inside and kept locked during the classes during the day. That provides the most protection because we're looking at barriers to slow these down. And we need to be prepared for those types of elements. As we think about it, the lower level of risk is called Tier 2. The higher level is called Tier 1. And this is where we start to see some of these signs categorizing that there's at least the beginnings of some risk. Someone that's experienced a loss, a divorce, a death, financial impact that could have occurred in there. Someone that has suddenly developed a substance abuse problem with an increase in drug or alcohol use. By the way, again, from a national standard standpoint, doing annual background checks on all staff and parent volunteers becomes very critical. And checking the Department of Motor Vehicle records, you're looking for DUIs here, even if they're not driving, because that could give you a feeling of a potential risk and exposure. If there's someone who got passed over or maybe their contract was not renewed, again, that aspect of humiliation. Now, when these Tier 2 events continue to escalate, they move to a Tier 1. Now, this is where multiple losses would be. Maybe there was a financial problem and it led to a divorce. If you're hearing any reference to suicide, intoxication in the workplace, obviously the weapon being brought to school, and remember the knife in the Pennsylvania example to carry forward. Mood swings, somebody that used to be very easygoing now suddenly is not, and there's tension in working with those individuals. The more of these aspects that are in place, the higher the potential and the higher the likelihood that it will escalate to a level of violence in the workplace. And you have to look at this over time. It's just not a snapshot of one time that would give you this. You have to view it in perspective, the relationships that you've seen with this particular individual. Now, in this example, we're talking about a ball. And if we threw the ball down and it bounced back up in the air, and you took a photograph of it, you couldn't tell from the photograph if the ball was going up or if it was actually falling back to the ground. So when you look at this, it needs to be more like a video or a movie so that you can look at the actions over a period of time. That will give you a better feeling of, are things escalating or are they de-escalating within that period of time? So the predict area here becomes the most critical when we talk about workplace violence. Predicting who the individual is that is the risk and the threat to your organization. It's much more that in a workplace than someone who has no relationship to your school who decides to come in and bring violence there. This is someone who has a relationship with your school, a parent, a spouse, an employee, a student. That's where the likely concerns rise, and that's why the predict area in looking at behaviors of concern becomes so critical. So the plan and the policies and procedures, you need to have a workplace violence plan. It needs to be written. You need to have specific policies and procedures in place, those procedures and process. A policy says what? A procedure or a process says how, and how you're going to deal with this. And we've talked about notification systems within the school. Do you have the ability to page throughout the entire school? How does that information come together? How does it come to you? How will you handle it? The proper way to conduct an investigation as you go through each of these areas to deal with it. Now, as we talked about it, we talked about having a behavioral threat risk assessment. And this is the way that you would go about developing that program, that plan within your school. You would see all of the areas that need to be addressed here. And we'll do a separate session, and perhaps maybe, Joe, we can do that at the November conference that you have coming up and go into much more detail here around those, around those areas, because this is most of the schools don't have this formalized to the level that it needs to be in identifying the players within your school that need to have these skills trained and addressed. Because we would do an initial investigation if there was concern, and you may at the initial level say it's not a problem. If it indicates that it could be, then we'll do a level 1 with internal staff involved, and if it looks like it's a significant enough threat, we'll involve external resources like a forensic psychologist to come in and conduct it. So looking at your internal and external resources, there has to be training, and the key here is the training to know what types of things that you're looking at. To go just a little bit more under the cover today, there are 4 types of threats. The highest one is a direct threat. That's a specific threat that there's going to be a specific act against a specific individual, and in many cases at a specific time. The more detailed the threat, I'm going to bring a gun tomorrow and I'm going to shoot Mary, that's obviously one that you cannot ignore. It's not a joke. Remember the FedEx example that we talked about that just occurred here. An indirect threat is a little bit more ambiguous. It lacks specificity. There's some violence implied, but obviously who it's targeted against or what, when it would occur. But again, any threat is one that you need to take and assume is a real threat. A veiled is a strong implication. Doesn't really say violence, and that is a conditional threat. If I don't get this, something's going to happen. If I don't get my contract renewed for next year, I'm going to have to deal with that matter. So it's not a normal basis for you to threaten another individual, whether it's conditioned, veiled, indirect, or direct. Those are certainly warning signs that we've been talking about that you should be concerned about. Now, if you want to go in a little bit more depth, we're going to look at this, dividing this into a low, medium, or high threat level. And you'll see some descriptions in the right-hand side of the page of trying to describe what those aspects are. And if you look at the bottom block here today, threat is direct, specific, and plausible or practical in design. Threat is repeated, escalating, and increasing in detail. Suggests detailed steps have been taken about carrying it out. Context of the threat suggests at-risk student has secured resources, has a definite intent and motivation, and or there's a strong history of conflict of previous high-risk behaviors, almost always requires law enforcement. If we get to the point that there's a threat made against another student, against a teacher, against the head of school or the principal, against anyone, you must take this seriously. That's why having a behavioral threat risk assessment team and a formal policy by which you review it and carry it through. One additional thing that's not on the slides that are up that we're talking about is this becomes a casework responsibility. If you had a 9th grader that has made a threat, you would follow that 9th grader through their 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th, and their 12th. Because again, that's been a warning sign, and you don't want to lose track of it, of that particular individual. We had a shooting that occurred this year from a student who had been seen as a problem in the fall, and the follow-up had not been carried forward by the school. Came back later with a gun to kill a teacher. Didn't kill the teacher, but killed a student. So once behavior has been identified in this area, you don't have a choice but to follow up and to carry it forward. So after you've gone through the predict phase, and then after you've gone through the plan phase and having the plan in place, then we have to perform. We've got to train people. We have to go through some exercises as we've done with this, and we've got to implement our plans and carry them through. How we want to respond and investigate on each one of these things, looking for the team members to have the background so that we can establish how we're going to follow up at every step along the way. Today, social media has become a key factor for every student in your school. And sometimes I think people live on their smartphones from this area. We followed a pattern for a particular student in an area, and I actually went back and looked at the tweets that had been posted by the student. And the student posted 280 tweets in one day. And you could see the pattern developing from that when you looked at it in its total. If you don't have a social media risk monitoring program in place within your school, you're losing one of the primary intelligence gathering opportunities so that you could be aware of what's going on. Remember the comment that we talked about earlier, the fact that there's leakage in these types of events, that 80% of the time someone else knows, and 66% of the time 2 or more people know of this particular area. Karen Mazzullo is the EVP for social media risk at Firestorm and works closely with businesses and schools in these areas. And we monitor some generic terms and phrases every day. And I shared earlier that we monitor school and gun. And that happens over 60 times a day, over 6 times a day. And she saw one posting which was a picture. It was a picture of a student holding a gun, a handgun, across their chest. And the other students were in the background in a classroom setting. And there were multiple tweets from students commenting about the fact that they couldn't believe that this person brought a gun to school today. Now, we know that when people assign names, they don't use their real name, a fan of Justin Bieber or whatever they want to call themselves. So Karen was startled by the picture and the volume of comments, and she searched through the streams that were listed. And by the way, when you monitor social media, you're monitoring a stream. A stream is made up of phrases, and phrases are made up of words. So normally a stream can be 10 phrases, 3 words per phrase as those areas come together. And in going through and searching that back, she found the name of a teacher mentioned, and later she found calculus, as in a calculus class. So she went on the internet and searched that teacher's name in calculus and was able to determine that the teacher was in a high school in North Carolina along the coast. It was a public school. And so she contacted the principal of the school and said, I don't know if this is a real or if it was a hoax, but here's the picture, here's the comments that were posted, and we felt that you would want to know. The principal thanked Karen greatly and dealt with the matter correctly with the student with the gun. But the thing that disturbed him the most was the fact that so many students were commenting on this, but none of them had come forward. They had been running a program in the school for 18 months on see something, say something, and they saw something and they didn't say something. So if you're not doing monitoring, you're cutting your intelligence pipeline of what's going on within your school around your area. That's a significant problem. I'd like you to think about that, and we can certainly talk more about that, and we'll do another webinar in the fall just on monitoring, or we'll do a session at the November conference on social media risk and the monitoring requirements. So Firestorm follows a predict, plan, perform process, and I would encourage you to do the same thing. You want to have a behavioral threat risk assessment program in place. You want to address the security issues with locking your external doors, locking your classrooms, running drills where you have the threat outside and the students inside, where you have the threat outside and the students outside, and then finally where you have the threat inside with the students inside. Anonymous reporting should be a prerequisite within all of your schools as we go forward. Predict, we want you to then look to make sure you have a workplace violence plan. You need an incident management process. You want a crisis management plan in your school. You want to use the standard protocols from the I Love You guys, the lockdown, lockout, shelter in place, evacuate, so that everyone understands those areas as you go forward. But the Behavioral Risk Assessment Team, BRAT, by the way, the acronym on Behavioral Threat Risk Assessment is BERTHA. So you want to have a BERTHA plan and a BRAT team together as those come into place. The perform then is preventative programs, training the students about see something, say something, having training with teachers to recognize behaviors of concern with students, creating the anonymous reporting so that it is easy to come forward and share that information. Your early level screening will mean that you won't spend time looking at things that are not realistic, that would not occur. But you will also then be prevented from losing those aspects of the people that are at higher risk. It is case management. Once you've identified a student that's a potential risk, you'll want to follow that student for their entire career within your school as that process goes into place. If you're unclear about where your plan is at this point, Firestorm, in working with the Tennessee Association of Independent Schools, would be delighted to conduct a self-assessment. It's a facilitated self-assessment with you on your school. It covers 8 different dimensions, about 5 questions in each of the areas. You'd receive back a findings report, as you've seen on the screen, and then you would also be getting a numerical scoring showing you where you are in each dimension relative to standards and best practices. We were also able to benchmark your school so that you know where you stand relative to the other schools. This has been underwritten by the Tennessee Association of Independent Schools, so it doesn't cost you or your school anything to go through and know where you are relative to standards and best practices. If you don't know, it could cost your school everything, and that's an important difference. So we'd like to thank the Tennessee Association of Independent Schools for underwriting this webinar series and coming together. Jill, is there anything you want to add at the end of today's webinar?
No, just many thank yous, because what you share is so pertinent and needed, and we appreciate all that you're providing.
And we appreciate you and the leadership that the association has had with schools across the state of Tennessee. So we look forward to meeting and speaking with you. If you've got individual questions, we'll try to reach out. One of our Firestorm principals is on the call today, Gertie Knox, and many of you have met her at the crisis coach workshops that we've done across Tennessee and Memphis and Knoxville and Nashville. And so Gertie will be reaching out to you to try to answer those questions, to find ways that we can help and share that.
Thank you so much. That is very helpful.
And if there are others in your school that you would like to see this webinar, it'll be available on demand at firestorm.com. They can log in and look at it there, or you can view it again to gain those insights along with all the other webinars that Firestorm and the association have done together. If you have a specific question, you can send us an email at webinars@firestorm.com, or you can call us at 800-321-2219. So I'll give you back your summer. We're sitting here today in early June, and I know you're enjoying the break from the classes during the year, and they'll be back in school sooner than later. I think I'm always impressed that school seems to start earlier every year than the previous year. I can remember not being in school at Labor Day, and by Labor Day now we've got students that have been in school in some cases a month. So enjoy the summer. We'll catch back up with everyone again in September, and see you all in November. Thanks, and have a great day. Thanks, Jill. Thanks for coordinating it. We look forward to talking with you again soon.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.